Edgar Allan Poe was born to traveling actors in Boston on January 19, 1809. Edgar was the second of three children. Within 3 years of Poe's birth, both of his parents had died. He was taken in by the wealthy tobacco merchant John Allan and his wife in Richmond, Virginia. Poe's siblings went to live with other families. Mr. Allan raised Poe to be a businessman and a Virginian gentleman, but Poe had dreams of being a writer. Poe had little interest in the tobacco business, and by the age of 13, Poe had compiled enough poetry to publish a book. But Mr. Allan wouldn't allow this. In 1826, Poe left Richmond to attend the University of Virginia, where he excelled in his classes, meanwhile accumulating considerable debt. Mr. Allan had sent Poe to college with less than a third of the money he had needed to survive, and Poe soon took up gambling to raise money to pay his expenses. By the end of his first term, Poe was so desperately poor that he burned his furniture to keep warm. Humiliated by his poverty and furious with Mr. Allan for not providing enough funds in the first place, Poe returned to Richmond and visited the home of his fiancée, Elmira Royster, only to discover that she had become engaged to another man in Poe's absence. The heartbroken Poe's last few months in the Allan mansion were filled with increasing hostility towards Allan, and until Poe finally stormed out of the home with hopes to become a great poet and to find adventure. Poe published his first book when he was only 18. To find adventure, he enlisted in the U.S. Army. 2 years later, he heard that Frances Allan, the only mother he had ever known, was dying of tuberculosis and wanted to see her before she died. By the time Poe returned to Richmond, she had already been buried. Poe and Allan briefly reconciled, and Allan helped Poe gain an appointment to the United States Military Academy at West Point. Before going to West Point, Poe published another volume of poetry. While there, he heard that Allan had remarried without telling him or even inviting him to the ceremony. Poe wrote to Allan detailing all the wrongs Allan had committed against him and threatened to get himself expelled from the academy. After only 8 months at West Point, Poe was thrown out, but he soon published yet another book. Broke and alone, Poe went to Baltimore. He called upon relatives in the city. Poe's Aunt Maria became a new mother to him and welcomed him into her home. Her daughter Virginia soon became the object of his desire. While Poe was in Baltimore, Allan died, leaving Poe out of his will. By then, Poe was living in poverty, but had started publishing his short stories, one of which won a contest sponsored by the Saturday Visitor. The connections Poe established through the contest allowed him to publish more stories and to eventually gain an editorial position at the Southern Literary Messenger in Richmond. It was at this magazine that Poe finally found his life's work as a magazine writer. Within a year, Poe helped make the Messenger the most popular magazine in the South, with his sensational stories as well as his biting book reviews. Poe soon developed a reputation as a fearless critic who not only attacked an author's work, but also insulted the author and the Northern literary establishment. Poe targeted some of the most famous writers in the country. At the age of 27, Poe brought Maria and Virginia to Richmond, and when he married Virginia, and that's where he married Virginia, who was not yet 14. But the marriage proved to be a happy one. Dissatisfied with his low pay and lack of editorial control at the Messenger, Poe moved to New York City. In the wake of his financial crisis known as the Panic of 1837, Poe struggled to find magazine work and wrote his only novel, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym. After a year in New York, Poe moved to Philadelphia in 1838 and wrote for a number of different magazines. He served as editor for a few magazines while continuing to sell articles to Alexander's Weekly Messenger and other journals. In spite of his growing fame, Poe was still barely able to make a living. For the publication of his first book of short stories, Tales of the Grotesque and Arboresque, He was only paid with 25 free copies of this book, of his own book. He would soon become a champion for the cause of higher wages for writers as well as for an international copyright law. To change the face of the magazine industry, he proposed starting his own journal, but he failed to find the necessary funding. In the face of poverty, Poe was still able to find solace at home with his wife and mother-in-law, but tragedy struck in 1842 when Poe's wife contracted tuberculosis, the disease that had already claimed Poe's mother, brother, and foster mother. Always in search of better opportunities, Poe moved to New York again in 1844 and introduced himself to the city by perpetuating a hoax. His news stories of a balloon trip across the ocean caused a sensation, and the public rushed to read everything about it, until Poe finally revealed that he had fooled them all. The January 1845 publication of The Raven made Poe a household name. He was now famous enough to draw large crowds to his lectures, and he was beginning to demand better pay for his work. He published 2 books that year and briefly lived his dream of running his own magazine when he bought out the owners of the Broadway Journal. The failure of the venture and rumors spreading about Poe's relationship with a married woman drove him out of the city in 1846. At this time, he moved to a tiny cottage in the country. It was there in the winter of 1847 that his wife Virginia died at the age of 24. Poe was devastated and was unable to write for months. His critics assumed that he soon would be dead, and they were right. Poe only lived another 2 years. He spent much of that time traveling from one city to the next, giving lectures, and finding backers for his latest proposed magazine project to be called The Stylus. While on lecture tour in Lowell, Massachusetts, Poe met and befriended Nancy Richmond. His idealized and platonic love of her inspired some of his greatest poetry, including For Annie. Since she remained married and unobtainable, Poe attempted to marry the poetess Sarah Helen Whitman in Providence, but the engagement only lasted about a month. In Richmond, he found his first fiancée, Elmira Royster Shelton, who was now a widow, so he began to court her again. Before he left Richmond on a trip to Philadelphia, he considered himself engaged to her. On the way to Philadelphia, Poe stopped in Baltimore and disappeared for 5 days. He was found in the bar room of a public house that was being used as a polling place for an election. A magazine editor sent Poe to Washington College Hospital, where Poe spent the last days of his life far from home and surrounded by strangers. Neither Poe's mother-in-law nor his fiancée knew what had become of him until they read about it in the newspapers. Poe died on October 7, 1849, at the age of 40. The exact cause of Poe's death remains a mystery.